Hello, Rob Laizure here and Brandon Smith. We're going to talk today about designing in 3Shape, designing a simple crown in less than 5 minutes. What Rebel 3 is all about is we are here to help solve your 3D problems and help you have a better life for you as dentists, for your patients, for any dental professional out there that wants to utilize their scanners, printers, bills, design software in the best way possible. That's what Rebel 3D is here to do. We're here to help you find success in your workflow and your design. And today we have Brandon Smith. Brandon, talk to us really quick. What are the two or three problems that we're going to help solve today in three?
So today I'm going to show you how to design a crown, a simple crown, and I'm going to go through some of the tools. Now, the biggest issue that I've run into with most people that I train on how to do this is not understanding really how the tools work and what tools you should use and what tools you should not use in a simple crown design. The other is, kind of talking about tooth selection, tooth library selection to be more specific. Um, Choosing a library that's closer to the patient's anatomy is really going to help speed up the design process. Typically, when I design a simple crown, I'm 5 to 8 minutes at the most. Um,
Nice.
and then, the last issue is, context and occlusion. That's always a big question that I get. How do I dial those in? And, how do I make sure that my crowns don't come out high in occlusion after they're milled? So those are really the
Fantastic.
three main things I'm going to hit on.
Perfect. All right, let's jump in, open up 3Shape, and why don't you go through a case quickly just to show us how fast you can design a case, and then we'll slow down and have you walk us through it step by step.
Yeah, definitely. So I've got a simple case here. This is a number 5. So I'm just going to run through it real quick. I'll show you the design, then I'll go back and kind of talk about it. So the case opens up pretty quick. First step is occlusal alignment, so I'll just align this really quick. I'll skip over these. Get into annotation, so I just have to tell the software where the tooth is. Path of insertion. Checking the margin marking. Usually it's pretty good. You might have to tweak a few little areas. And then die interface, this is all controlled by the material file settings, so I don't typically need to make adjustments here unless I have to change something.
Controlled by your control panel material settings.
Yes. So it pops me
Perfect.
in, and I always start designing the same way. So I'm going to run through here real quick and put this tooth in position.
So these bigger global adjustments come first.
Yeah,
Um, you're paying attention to things like buccal corridor, cusp position. You're not worried about emergence profile yet, right? Because it's not even connected to margin.
right. This is checking my contacts with the opposing. So I'm going to fix this cusp here. Build this out a little bit. If I get my design closer to the margin before I actually cut it to the margin, my proposal turns out a lot better. So I always try to morph out my tooth a little bit and pull it into the margins a little.
Okay.
Then once I get it roughly positioned, now I'll cut it to my margins. Again, these settings are controlled by the material file, so I don't really have to change anything. And you can see there's no overly bulky areas yet. I do have a minimal thickness issue there, so I'll fix that.
How many crowns you design in your career there, Brandon?
I
Thousands?
would say I'm probably somewhere in the range of 10 to 20,000.
Nice. Nice. Doing your final checks here.
I want to make sure that I'm not too far out of occlusion, but I also don't want my marginal ridges to be too high. I also try to make as nice and broad a contact as I can. Then the last things I do here is I cut the occlusion out. This is my set value for my lab, but everything's a little different. So I'll cut the tooth out first. That gives me a little space all the way around, so that I don't end up high in occlusion. And then the last thing I do is I cut my contacts. So these red circles indicate where I have contact with the adjacent teeth. And then I just go ahead and check the shape of my contacts a little bit to make sure I don't have any undercuts underneath. So I'll do that by just kind of smoothing some of this away down here. And then sometimes I'll go back and I'll make sure I'm good. And that is crown design.
Done. Right
Yep.
about 5 minutes. That's amazing. So consistently 5 to 8 minutes for a simple single unit once you're trained and you're utilizing the software well. So let's go back to the beginning and walk us through again. And you had mentioned just the importance of, utilizing the tools. Like I'm assuming there's certain tools you're
Yeah.
paying attention to and others that, you're just letting the software do its thing. You're just relying on the software to, solve those problems for you. And
Yeah.
then library selection and then contact and occlusion. So yeah, walk us through again and just explain what you're doing.
Yep. So the very first step it starts you off in is called the prepare step. So everything that we do in 3Shape is workflow driven, or runs across this workflow bar at the top here. So I can't just save and close out whenever I want and get a crown design. I have to complete the whole workflow bar. So this first step, this is occlusal alignment. It basically tells the software where the plane of occlusion should start off. You want to try to get this right around where your plane of occlusion of your crown is going to be. Um, Everybody's a little different, so this plane is flat. It's not going to have curve of Spee or curve of Wilson in it, so you just want to kind of get it in the ballpark. I usually focus on the two adjacent teeth when I'm doing this. So I don't care about this tooth back here. I don't care about these teeth here. I only really care about the space where my design's going. So I look at this canine here and this molar here, and that's how I determine where my plane of occlusion goes.
Anything to stress or worry about in this selection, this step, plane of occlusion?
No, really just setting that plane of occlusion. There's a few little controls with it. You can tilt and tip it, you can move it up and down, but for the most part, it's just pretty straightforward. This
And
step,
does that
these two,
plane affect the virtual or, sorry, keep going.
go ahead. The
Does
plane
it
does
affect the
also,
virtual articulator?
yeah, it does set the virtual articulator plane as well if you're using it, but for the most part on single unit posterior crowns, I don't use the virtual articulator. When I start getting into
Gotcha.
larger bridges and anterior work, I'll use the virtual articulator more. Um, Here we've got our sculpt steps. These just let you edit the scans. You can do, you can remove adjacent teeth. You can remove opposing teeth. If there's, an issue with some undercuts or something in the prep itself, you can add material and kind of block those out. The software does that
Nice.
for you when you do the cement spacer, so there's not a real big purpose to do it here. Mainly when I design, I only do things like remove teeth. Sometimes I'll get a doctor that will call and say, hey, we ended up extracting the opposing tooth. So there is no opposing. So I'll come in here and, let's say it's this molar, I'll come in here and I'll select it and I'll remove it. so that I don't have to deal with that tooth encroaching in the space. A lot of times doctors will do that if the tooth is super erupted and they know that they're going to place maybe an implant or something there.
Nice.
But it's a really simple process to do.
Very
From
cool.
here, you go into the annotations, which the annotations just basically tells the software where the tooth is. Um, the biggest thing to make sure you do here is you want this point that you place to be on the buccal of the tooth. What this sets is not just where the tooth goes, but the orientation of the tooth. So that dot tells the software where the buccal of the library tooth should face. So if I put it here on the lingual, then it's going to turn the tooth around and it's going to be backwards when you go into the smile composer.
Got it.
Um, if some places have, someone else who does scanning and someone else who does designing. If the scanner puts it in the wrong position, because it's actually done during the scanning process, you can check this ignore scanning annotations box here, and that will remove it, and then you can place it yourself.
Nice.
But that's really it to this step. There's not much else here. Path of insertion, this just sets the draw off of the prep of the crown tooth. The things that I look for here are actually not just the prep itself, but I also look at the contact teeth adjacent to it. If I set my path like this based off of the shape of the prep, I'm going to have an issue with this contact over here. It's going to be very pinpoint. So I want to make sure that I set this in a way where I can see straight down the prep and also straight down those contact walls. You can reset it by changing your view to look straight down and then just hit this set button over here on the left and that will set it.
So whatever the view is, it's just going to reset it to that view.
Yeah.
Nice. Perfect.
Margin marking here, this is pretty straightforward. It places a margin on here. Now, if you're using a desktop scanner and you mark the margins on the model itself before you scan it, it will actually put the color in here.
Nice.
And if you've
With the
marked the
texture
margin, you'll
scan.
see the red line. 3Shape has this feature built into it that not a lot of people know about, but it looks for that red line and it actually tries to place the margin on the red line. So if you are
Perfect.
doing that, you can, get it a little bit closer sometimes if it's an unclear prep.
Nice. So
Dude,
if the doctor trimmed his own margin, it would show up in the scan, but he'd have to have a lab scanner. If he's got
yeah,
a trios, then, just got to
yeah.
retract and
Most
expose that margin and get a good scan.
Yeah, most doctors are going to be scanning with a Trios or an intraoral scanner, so they're not going to have that ability. But with if they have a desktop scanner for whatever reason, they could do it that way and take a normal stone
Cool.
cast or even an impression scan. They can actually draw in the
Oh,
impression and it will pick it up too, because it'll invert the
nice.
color onto the 3D model.
Fantastic.
Simple things I look at here are obviously where the margin is. You have a lot of tools, so you can see this small little cross section that I have here on the screen as I move over the margin line. That blue dot signifies where the line is on the profile of the tooth, wherever my mouse is. So you can see the red line that's moving around the die as I do this. That is the profile that it shows there in that 2D cross section. So if I see that my margin's marked, for example, down here, you'll see as I hover my mouse over that spot, the blue dot is below the peak of where that margin should be. You'll also notice that the outline turns red. That signifies that there's an undercut somewhere that the margin is going through. And then these dots indicate where that undercut actually is. You can turn on over here on the left the show undercuts and it will show it as well. So if you're having trouble finding where the margin goes, if you just mark it right above that undercut, it'll fix
Nice.
that. Yep. These settings here, these are all held in the control panel for the material that you selected. If you need to make adjustments to the fit settings, say you're getting too loose of a fit or too tight of a fit, if you adjust them here, it's only going to adjust it on this particular case that you're working on. If you want it
Got
to
it.
adjust across the board, you have to go into the control panel and plug those new settings in there. If you choose the wrong material in your order form and you're trying to just get through the design, you can drop down this name box here and any of your other materials will show up. And as you choose them, you'll see your settings will change to those settings for that
Nice.
other material. So you
So
can do it on the fly.
you could create other material types for different fit settings if you wanted to have a few
Yeah.
options.
Yeah, the
Cool.
software will even allow you to plug in, if you're a lab working with doctors, or maybe you're a designer that works with other doctors. Um, what you can do is you can plug in those doctors into the control panel, and then you can plug in custom settings for each doctor. So if one doctor likes their fits tighter than the other, you can set up that doctor and then plug in their custom fit settings, and it's all material specific. So their zirconia could be one setting, their Emax could be another setting, their
Nice.
PFMs and full cast could be another setting. You can do all that individual to each doctor. And
That is
then when you
awesome.
choose that specific material, as long as you chose that doctor in your order form, it will change the default settings over to the doctor specific settings here.
Fantastic.
Yep. And then here in the design, this is where we would go in and choose a tooth. So I'm going to undo my design and just kind of walk through what my thought process is when I do the design a little slower. So the first thing you always want to do, and this is how I do mine, is I kind of move out from my case so I can see the whole plane of occlusion here on my scan. And then if you'll see this smile up here under smile library here, when I select that, it actually pulls up all of the tooth libraries that I have in the software. So this is a custom library that I created based off of the Dentsply tooth libraries for dentures. You can create your own
Nice.
libraries. There's a lot of stock default libraries. There's downloadable libraries that you can pull in the control panel. There's even companies that will give you different tooth libraries. Some of them are paid, some of them are free, but as you see when I scroll down, there's all kinds of different options in here. Um, and I can see what they look
Well,
like on the main screen here when I select them. So if
will
I
we
want to
have any of
switch,
your will any of your tooth libraries be available for download on Rebel 3D?
yeah, I'm going to make a DME of a lot of the libraries that I use, and then that will be able to be
Fantastic.
downloaded and imported right into the 3Shape, and then they'll be able to use it. Um,
Nice. Fantastic.
so
That'll be really cool.
a lot of this stuff here is stock. So this is the one I typically use a lot for posterior cases. When they have a decent amount of anatomy. If they don't, then sometimes I'll go down here and I'll use maybe this one if I need a really heavily worn, or there's the Culp library that's pretty worn. So just really depends on what it looks like there. I'm going to use the Genius that I created here. So once I select it, I just hit OK. You'll also notice that my tooth is a ponic. It's not actually connected to the prep yet. This is also a setting in the control panel that you need to adjust. By default, it's turned off. So what that means is that when you come in here, whatever tooth library is selected will actually be connected at the margin when you first come in, which I turn that off because if I need to make significant moves to that position of that tooth, if it's already connected, it warps that bottom third of the tooth. So I always make sure mine starts off as a ponic like this.
I've
And
heard that as a
as I
common
go,
strategy. You get your global
yeah,
settings first and then you connect to margin.
yep. So as I go through, I'm going to use the same approach I use on every single case when I design. I don't deviate this at all. I use this for singles, multiples, posterior, anterior, doesn't matter what it is. I always do this approach. So Over here on the left, you have all these tools. Now, I'm not going to use all of these tools to design this case. I'm only going to use a few. You don't need them all for every single case. Most of them are specialty tools that you might use on a couple cases here and there. But for the most part, I'm going to show you just the tools I use. So I start off here under single tooth tools, and then you have your individual transformation tool. So this tool gives you all these global transform tools on this, and it allows me to actually grab the tooth with my mouse and I can move it around. So this is why I start, and I kind of take the philosophy of start big and then end small as I'm doing this. So I'm going to start with the tool that does the biggest amount of moves, which is this global transformation tool. So I start off by looking at it from a buccal view like this, and I'll rotate it into position. And then I kind of move around different views here and look at it and try to get it positioned and resized the way that I want. So I kind of take the whole approach of filling the space a little bit and making sure that it's kind of in there. I align all the buccal cusps. I try to align all the lingual cusps as well to make sure everything's in place. Now you'll notice that my tooth is still high in occlusion. There are some sliders over here. So there's one called collision lines at the top right that turns on basically anywhere where my design tooth collides with a scan of any type. And then I also have my minimum thickness slider here that I turn on as well so that I can see where I'm too thin. All of that thin thickness is controlled by, again, that material file. So making sure that that's accurate is really important here. Otherwise, you'll design your crowns too thin or too thick, and then they'll be over contoured or they'll break because they're too thin. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over. I've got my tooth kind of rough positioned in here about where I want it. I'm going to go in and now move to my morphing tool, which is the one right next to it. And this tool allows me to push and pull areas and kind of move anatomical landmarks around. So I'm going to start off with that. There are hotkeys that are associated with some of these tools. All of those can be found in the user's manual, which is part of the software. So the first tool, this morphing tool, if you hold the shift key and scroll the mouse wheel, it'll let you change the circle size, and then the control key will allow you to use this arrow. So I use a lot of the arrow and the circle size changing, so I don't have to constantly go back and forth from the tools over to the design. So I'm just going to pull some areas down and start kind of really placing this in position where I want it. I can use it to close embrasure spaces and make sure I've got nice big contacts. And I can also use it to fix minimal thickness issues wherever I see them. I also like to always look at mine. So the patient's always going to see this in this kind of a view here. They're never going to look at it from this view. So it has to fit in here. So I want to make sure that the curvature of the buccal surface matches the curvature of the adjacent teeth. Otherwise, it won't fit in. So I'm going to kind of tip this in a little bit. I'm going to give it a little bit more curve to it.
Really good point of how a patient views their tooth versus, us technicians and doctors, right?
Yeah. Sometimes I will move back if I've missed something. So I didn't like the position of the buccal cusp. I thought it was out too far, so I used the transform tool to tip it back in. And you will do that from time to time, as long as you're not doing it an extreme amount, just because the more you go back and forth between the tools, the longer the design will take. The other thing I'll do is I'll look at it from the bottom here, and I can see the outline of my margin in certain areas. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use my morphing tool here to kind of pull this back in towards the margin. What this is going to do for me is it's going to save me time after I morph it to the actual margins. where it'll actually be closer to the contour of the margin, and I won't get those big bulky areas that a lot of people get when they design and um, have these over contoured areas, because the gingival third is pretty difficult to see. Especially if you're like me, I like to have the tissue contour here down at the margin area so I can see what my emergence needs to look like. And then once I get the contour about where I want it, I'll check the bite, make sure that the bite looks good. Everything looks like it falls into place pretty well here. So now I'm going to morph it to the margins. And again, these settings here, these are all controlled by the material file. So unless I need to change something based off of results, I don't touch them. So I'll hit the apply button
Nice.
here, and that will morph it to the margin. And if you look, I don't have really any over contoured areas because I pushed everything into the margin before I morphed it. So that's huge. Doing that, otherwise you're going to end up with a lot of bulk down here that you're going to have to clean up.
Nice. Thinking ahead a little bit there.
Yep. So now I move into my smoothing tool here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean up any little bulky areas down here. Now you can kind of see these shadows along my margin. Those are slightly over contoured, so I'm going to go in here and I'm going to kind of smooth these up. If I make my margin areas too bulky, then it's going to affect my emergence. And what'll happen is I'll push too much tissue, or I'll create bacteria traps down there where the
Hmm.
when you chew, the tooth will push the food down there, and it'll get trapped under a ledge. We don't want to see that here. So we want the area right at the margin to be decently thin here so that it contours well to the tooth itself. So what I should end up seeing is this nice ledge all the way around. The only time I won't really be able to see that is a lot of times with implant cases, which is kind of outside of what we're doing here. You tend to have to bulk those out to create the proper emergence. But other than that, unless you're filling a really large space with a tooth, you don't need to have those areas super bulky.
Nice.
So now I just check general line angles. If I need to adjust any of those, a lot of times I'll use this tool to adjust those a little bit. I'll look again at my buccal corridor. I always come back here and try to make sure that my shape kind of fits in with everything else. If my if anything needs adjusted or I need to go back to another tool, I can do that. I think overall it looks pretty good. So now I'm ready to adjust my occlusion. So to adjust the occlusion, I'll go here to my Smart Tools. This contacts and smoothing button here will allow me to cut it out. Now, there is a cut contacts, so adjacent contacts, but I'm not a huge fan of it, so I don't use it just because it makes weird shapes in there. So what I'll do is I'll cut out my occlusion. You always want to use the second one and not the third one, because the third one, what it does is it just kind of cuts everything and makes it flat where it was too close. It'll cut out a lot of the anatomy of the tooth that you designed. So you
Hmm.
want to use the desired, not the precise. So once I have
Okay.
my value in here, now this value is not set by a material file. It's all strictly results driven. So you'll have to cut a few of these out and check what your results are after the crown is milled or milled and centered, and see what your occlusal contacts look like. If things are heavy, you'll want to cut it out with a higher value. If things are too far out of occlusion, you'll want to go down in value. Um,
Okay.
I use 0.25. That's just what our lab has found as our result. Every lab, every doctor, it's all going to be different because everybody uses different equipment. Every piece of equipment, it falls within a certain tolerance of each other. So I could have two, for example, Roland mills that could be, within tolerance of each other, but I could get a different result from each one with the same settings.
Hmm.
So it's always got to be results driven um, and tested to make sure that these are the correct values. So all this
What I've
does
seen and
for
heard is
me,
like
do what?
what I've seen and heard is 0.25 to zero point 0.3 is a really common occlusal adjustment. Like, so start somewhere in that range and adjust from there.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And one of the reasons that we cut these out is to account for a few things. It's obviously a little bit of manufacturing tolerance in there. But then you also have to think about your overall process with these after they're manufactured. They don't just come off of the mill and they're completely done. You still have to add some stain and glaze back to them, and those materials do have a little bit of thickness. So when you look at 0.25, that's 250 microns. That's a fraction of a millimeter that you're cutting these out.
Yeah.
You're going to add some of that back when you stain and glaze it too. Now, if you're doing it on the flip side, and let's say you're doing like a PMMA or an acrylic crown or some kind of temporary, and all you're doing is polishing it, you may want to cut these out less because the act of polishing is going to remove material from the surface of the tooth.
Mm,
So you could cut it way too far out of occlusion, then it'll have no occlusal contact.
good point. Really good point.
So I'm going to go ahead and cut mine, and you'll see as I zoom in here, um, you'll see it'll cut out any areas of the crown that are closer than this value. So it mostly cut out this lingual cusp here. So I've got my occlusion where I want it. I need to go back and check. So you can see it created a little minimal thickness violation there. So I'm going to use my morphing tool here to pull that back up so that I don't violate the material thickness. And then I'm really going to look at my contacts here. So I want to make sure that the shape of the contacts I'm going to get is appropriate for this case. So I like the shape of the contacts right now. So what I'm going to do is, rather than using the smart tool here, because what it does tend to do is it creates some odd shapes in there sometimes if the contacts aren't ideal. So I actually go back here to my smoothing tool, or I'm sorry, my wax knife tools, and I use the negative tool. And there's these four icons down here that a lot of people don't even use. What these do is they control how much you can take away or add to a surface based on the scan that's intersecting it. So this first one is for the preparation scan, which is basically this scan here. So any area that it intersects, my tooth intersects through the scan, it will allow me to adjust it to whatever this value is in the box. So I use
Nice.
0 typically. Again, this value is results driven. So if your contacts are coming out heavy, you'll want to make it a higher value so it cuts more of a space. If your contacts are coming out too light, then you'll want to go to a negative value so it cuts it heavy in the design. So
Fantastic.
what I'll do now is you have to make sure that this icon is selected, and you'll just kind of take your smoothing tool and you'll brush through it, and you'll see it stops me when I hit that 0 value. So I can't take away more and I can't add any more to it. So I'll just go through each contact and just brush them like that. And then you'll see that I get a much nicer shaped contact there. Sometimes if I see like these sharp edges that it creates, I will take my smoothing tool and I'll just kind of go in here and I'll blend this so it's more of a rounded shape. The other nice thing about doing this is whoever finishes the crown will visibly on the side of the crown really be able to see that whole outline of the contact area. So they'll know where to adjust the crown when they need to, if it's not seating well.
Makes sense.
Yep. And then from here, I just go forward and I'm done. You always want to cut your contacts and occlusion last, because if you go back and you make any changes, it voids out what you did and you'll have to redo it. So that's why I do it that way.
Amazing. Well, Brandon, thank you for your time.
Yeah.
Doing 10 or 20,000 of these, you've learned a few things. I know you have a passion for teaching and for training. Tell me a little bit about that. Like, what do you do for clinics, for teaching them or training them? How do you help them if they've got 3Shape or 3D printers? Like, what kind of services do you offer to doctors who need help with their digital workflow?
Yeah, so I I'm a certified trainer in a couple different intraoral scanners. I'm also obviously certified in well experienced with dental system from 3Shape, and I've got experience with Roland Mills, and I'm now also a KOL for Asiga, so I know their printers really well. But I've basically I've built my whole training around workflows. So I don't just come out and show design or show how to use a printer. I try to look at what the customer is doing, and I try to evaluate their workflows, and I try to improve them, or I try to help them implement new workflows. But it starts from the very beginning and goes all the way through finishing of the prosthetic. So I'm a well-rounded technician, so I know, crown and bridge real well, dentures, partials, pretty much everything that the lab can make, I can do. So that's kind of where I've centered my business around, is trying to help other individuals get these workflows implemented into their practices, and make sure that they get up and running, and have the resources to be successful with it.
That's awesome. So you could offer, virtual remote support, training them, showing them stuff virtually, or if they need to go hands-on, you're willing to go to their clinic and go hands-on with the doctor
Yeah.
and their team. That's fantastic.
Yep. And I do, for the most part, I've offered both, and I get more of the in person than I do the remote.
I bet. Yeah, it's probably a lot easier to dive in and really solve the problems, create the smooth workflow when you're there with the
Yeah.
doctor and their staff. And so for any of you that need help in the clinic with scanning, designing, workflow, milling, printing, Brandon's available to come to your clinic and help. You could find him at rebel3d.com/Brandon. And there's more information about what he excels in and what the prices are to get him to come out and help you. Awesome, Brandon. Thank you so much. We'll be seeing you again, maybe some denture design or doing some implants. Be kind
Yeah.
of fun.
Yeah. Thanks, Rob.
All right, buddy. Good to have you.
Thank you.